All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our March webinar installment here at Products That Count. I am super excited to be joined by our guest this month, Jeff Kayne. I'm going to give him an opportunity to introduce himself and his background here momentarily. But before we dive in there, I just want to orient folks who are new to our webinar program here at Products That Count. My name is Dan Hammaker. I am head of chapter for New York City for Products That Count. I help coordinate our community in New York, bring people together in the ecosystem who are interested in product and aligned to our mission to evangelize best practices in product management. As part of that role, I help organize in-person events and host these monthly webinars. And recently, we have been working on highlighting areas of AI development that seem to be very top of mind for the PMs that I talk to on a regular basis and who I know engage with our content here at Products That Count. And so for that reason, I'm super excited to welcome Jeff, the CEO and founder of Trubrics, who is going to be talking to us a little bit about measuring the impact of AI. Jeff, welcome. Do you mind just giving everybody a brief introduction to yourself and your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. I'm super excited to be here today to speak to you and to everyone at Products That Count. So yeah, a bit of my background. So I'm originally an engineer. I went into data science about say 7 years ago now. Started working at a consultancy where I was basically building out data science models, whether that be kind of forecasting, NLP. I kind of worked on different data, but very centered around building machine learning models. And then kind of went into a bit more of like a machine learning engineer role, where there I was helping to productionize quite a lot of these models and bring kind of these models that were very in the hands of data scientists into production applications. And then about 3 years ago now, I left to start my own company called Trubrics, and there I am co-founder. We're basically building product analytics for LLMs. So hopefully this content will be very relevant for most of the audience who is very product focused. And I think, yeah, what we really want to get into is measuring AI impacts, but also how sort of product managers can really look at AI and how product managers can be super useful actually to AI engineering teams, even though it feels maybe daunting and feels like that it's very technical at the start. I think you actually have a massive competitive edge as a product manager. And so, looking forward to getting into that.
Yeah, same here. And I think just addressing head on the fact that some of the subject matter is a little bit intimidating, right? For people, it's very new. There are probably more questions than answers at this stage. I think just acknowledging that is where many of us are at this time, and we're all trying to figure out this kind of new technology and how to apply it in a practical and effective way. That's what we're here to talk about. And so, if that's where your head's at, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. So, something I think just as we were getting prepped for this conversation, Jeff, I know we wanted to draw out a little bit of some of the differences between, measuring the impact of AI-enabled capabilities versus some more, let's say, traditional software capabilities that we've been working on over the last decade plus. You've obviously got a company now focused on this, so I know you see the differentiation here, but can you just describe a little bit of why measuring the impact of AI enablement and maybe especially, the applications of large language models, why that's so different?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fundamentals here is that traditional software and software with AI is fundamentally different, kind of for one reason, and that is that traditional software is basically a set of rules. We as engineers, as developers, and you guys as product managers, we will build out kind of predefined workflows where we will then translate that into like specs into code, and then those rules will then run, and that will constitute your application. The difference with kind of AI and machine learning as well, but before kind of LLMs, is that now you have this massive probabilistic attribute to your applications that are not actually just following a set of rules that you've predefined, but they're actually making up the rules live, in the application with the user. And so this comes with kind of a number of challenges. But it's also opens up the sphere for a lot of really interesting things that you can actually learn about your users. And then I guess how this changes things for product analytics is typically what we're building. So product analytics before was really about understanding your user, but about how are they behaving in your website? Where are they clicking, or whether that be on your application, mobile, where are they clicking, and what pages are they seeing, and what does that user journey look like? Now with this sort of integration of AI, and like you mentioned, particularly with large language models, any of these kind of models that are user facing, that really changes up that whole user experience for that user, because they're not kind of following these predefined workflows that you've built out for them anymore, but they're actually kind of interacting with a very versatile AI agent or AI assistant. And so from a product analytics point of view, their interactions with that model become super interesting because they're not bound to a specific workflow. They're completely unbound, and they can kind of ask that model anything that they like, and they can build up their own kind of workflows. And so you're not kind of going through this funnel that we're so used to seeing our customers go through. Now we're kind of seeing users build their own paths and get from A to B in very, very different ways. I think that really hits at sort of the differences between traditional software and now these more, in a lot of cases, we're seeing more conversational workflows.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think through some of the probabilistic and stochastic considerations with AI outputs, especially. I know, as it pertains to delivering software, right? Obviously, everybody is familiar with some version of a software development lifecycle. You have user needs you gather, you translate those into some tasks that are workable by developers. They build. We get to a point where we're testing or we're refining the feature before we make it available to production, maybe preview then production. There's this period of testing and refining, and I know this is something I've experienced in my own working day to day in delivering AI tools, where now you're trying to benchmark and evaluate the efficacy of your tool in defining these high-level attributes that you expect to see every time, and running through some analysis, often led by one of your machine learning engineers or AI specialists, to kind of benchmark the tool and come up with some level of quality that you can quantify, that you can then defend to say, all right, we're ready to ship. But I know then when something's out in the wild, going back and leveraging those benchmarks can be tricky. So how do you think about the role of benchmarks and evaluations in sort of the overall measurement of AI efficacy and impact?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think you're completely right to distinguish kind of benchmarks, evals, and then more kind of analytics and let's say production metrics. I think benchmarks, like we're seeing now, with the new models. I think Claude 3.7 came out just recently, and these benchmarks they're kind of getting depleted, and it's actually very difficult to build meaningful benchmarks. And so for any application builders, benchmarks are really not a good way of selecting a model. I mean, you can get a good understanding of some of the reasoning capabilities, or some specific maybe benchmarks on a specific area, for example, like code generation, that could be useful for you. But what really is going to be interesting for you building an application on top of these large language models is really what you talked about with evals. And so the story with evals is that evals have been around in machine learning for ages, and it's really just this notion of building out some form of set of examples that are a stable set of examples that you have picked out and that you can validate basically your model against. And so if ever you change anything, for example, if you're changing a prompt or if you're updating a model version, you're updating some of the parameters maybe, um, those evals basically are your kind of gold standard for, before we're actually shipping this. This is it's going to have to pass all these evals. They are very similar to integration tests for those who are familiar with kind of integration testing and testing in software. And that's definitely how we should still be thinking about AI. And so there are huge parallels to take from traditional software and AI, although it seems very different on the face of it. The way we actually go about evaluating it is very different. And then the third category, which I think is the place where product managers can be most useful, is once you actually get that software into production and your users are starting to interact with it, then there becomes a whole question of, okay, well, is that test set that we built, those evaluations that we built, how actually do they measure up against the real world usage? Are my users actually using it in the way that we've built this test set and we've validated our model? Or are we actually seeing completely different usage patterns of our users where they're asking the model completely different things that we hadn't thought about kind of before releasing? And I think this is kind of this digging into these product metrics. I think we'll get into it in a little bit, but that's really where kind of a lot of review of what is happening, how these users are interacting with the models, can be super valuable to feed back to the engineering team. And then it definitely does feed back into either sort of complete autonomous feedback loops, which feed back into the model. But in most cases, it actually just feeds back into your eval data set and makes that data set more robust over time. Because I think the last thing I'll say on here is that evals, it's not a case of doing evaluating your model once and then these tests will never evolve. Those evals and that data set that you're continuously validating your model with is also continuously should be evolving over time. And it's super important that you guys as a team, you are evolving that data set, and that data set is as close as possible to the real world scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's a great opportunity to transition and talk a little bit about what it looks like to actually potentially collect that data set and even collect the metadata on top of that data set, right? To better understand usage and engagement. So again, I know you live and breathe this on a day-to-day basis at this point, but for many of us, this is brand new territory. So can you just describe a little bit of, again, what it looks like today to capture some of this data, what kind of data maybe you want to think about capturing, and also how that difference that is different from data that we've captured on traditional SaaS.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the first group of kind of metrics that we were just talking about, which are, let's say they're the more offline technical metrics that you're looking at when you're evaluating. So you're running kind of metrics on those evals. They're still super important, and I think that yeah, the first thing that you would maybe want to take into consideration is that when you're kind of validating your model on that test set, really like it's important not to get stuck here, kind of over optimizing any sort of prompt template or anything on that evaluation data set. This in traditional machine learning is actually called overfitting. It's a very common thing that data scientists are super used to reviewing. And yeah, it applies completely now again to LLMs. But yeah, if we're really talking about kind of product metrics, once you're live and you've got some actual users who are interacting with your LLMs, the first thing I'd say here is these metrics are really application dependent. It's like analytics in the sense that if you're looking at a product analytics dashboard for a B2B SaaS app compared to another B2B SaaS app, their dashboards that they're going to be looking at, their product metrics, their hero metrics, they're going to be very different depending on the company, depending on what you're trying to optimize for, depending on how you measure success. And this is completely the same. And we speak to thousands of PMs, and they are really sort of trying to ask us about how do we go about sort of measuring success. And I really often answer to them, well, how do you go about measuring success of your product before you integrated AI? Because that question there is going to be different for every company. And so it's super important for you guys to think through, okay, well, even with the integration of AI, there is still, I still have a notion of kind of what success looks like from my product. And I think it's super important to stay focused on that. And then, yeah, if we double click onto some of the data that you were talking about and you were referring to, the first one, like you mentioned, is really usage, and trying to get an understanding of, some of the early adopters, who are your power users, for example, and how are they using the model. Now, you may have heard, like, if you're developing with AI, there's this thing that gets thrown around where you're sort of vibe testing the model. And it kind of, what that translates to is you're just interacting with the model yourself, and you're trying to build up an intuition for where the model is good or where it is potentially not so good. What workflows you can get success from users from, and what workflows are just not really working. I think what's really interesting about this notion of vibe check is it's not necessarily our own vibe check that's important, but what you get by reviewing kind of your power users, for example, is you see how they vibe check your model. And so all of a sudden, because they will test out the model, that's how humans interact with sort of any type of copilot or chat interface. They will sort of say exactly things how they want to say it, and they will see how the model responds. And so, yeah, that notion of really understanding how your users are vibe testing your application, I can be super powerful, and relaying that information back to your engineering team is really cool, and something that we push PMs to do.
Yeah, and I mean, without revealing any secret sauce or anything, I'm just curious, like, what are some ways to quantify a vibe check? How would you go about actually measuring and producing some metrics and some level of insight into like the vibe checks? I think it's super important, but that sounds super nebulous, and I'm curious how you approach that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing I think we talk about addressing kind of the elephant in the room is user feedback, as kind of metadata that you collect along with these models. And so we're all used to seeing kind of explicit user feedback, that we can collect alongside any of these user interactions. And you guys have all used ChatGPT, and you've probably actually never really used the thumbs up or thumbs down button. And so explicit user feedback is only as good as how much of that you're actually able to collect. Sometimes you can embed this really into the workflow. And so you can have kind of maybe propositions. Sometimes, if to take the example of OpenAI again, they actually within ChatGPT every now and then they'll show you two generations of the model, and you can pick one. And that's how they force you really to start collecting that explicit user feedback. But then what's really interesting, I think, is kind of how to quantify that vibe check. Is the second type of user feedback, which is more what we call implicit user feedback. And this is kind of actually nested into the messages themselves, because obviously within a conversation, your users are actually giving feedback on the previous message in the next message. If they're re-asking the same question twice, for example, this is a really classic metric that we see product teams looking for. How many times is a user sort of reformulating the same question to try and poke the LLM in different ways. And that's kind of how, with setting up a specific metric like that, you can then sort of measure that over time. You can then break that down by your different users. You can then also break that down by different topics that users are discussing, or for example, different user intents. And yeah, this is something that like definitely encourage everyone to play around with, because it can be super important, and super valuable for you to understand. It's a way of segmenting users, and it's a very powerful way, and a very rich way of segmenting users.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think some of those examples are interesting, right? Those are examples where the application of the LLM is in a sort of chat user experience, and so you're looking for insights from the interaction patterns that you can maybe aggregate into some metrics. Obviously, there are other ways you can integrate LLMs as well, right? For example, you could have some sort of data extraction or analysis process that is initiated with some front-end control. You're essentially passing a payload with a prompt to
Mhm.
a model and then surfacing the result that it returns to your users. But they're not interacting with the model in the same way, with this sort of natural chat style interface. So curious, as you think about the different applications of LLMs and some of the different user experiences built on top, how do you think about different metrics that might be important to measure?
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely distinguish kind of the user-facing LLM where the LLM is actually prompting the model, and the model is generating based on that user input, to use cases where you're potentially building more like automated workflows, for example, where you're without really prompting the model, but by triggering different workflows. That is, for example, a very classic one that we see a lot of is summaries of information. For example, for a lawyer who's using an AI copilot, they're not necessarily actually interacting with that. That is one of the features, but some of the features that are super impactful for lawyers is just getting a summary of the different drafts that are coming in. And so, for example, for a summary feature, what then becomes really important is not so much looking at the user interaction before, because obviously there's not really much that they're actually prompting the model with, but then seeing kind of what they do with that summary. And so this is really important to think about user experience and also design, because depending on how you kind of package up, for example, that summary, you can have the very simple, at the very least, maybe a copy button that allows kind of people that they might be copying that, sending it in a Slack message or an email to their team. And that's kind of some sort of the signals that you should be looking for. Better still, you can start to, in some of those interfaces, you can have maybe some way of editing that text. And so more of a collaborative environment where the LLM is generating some sort of response. You're not actually chatting to it, but you're kind of editing that in live. Instead of, we're all very guilty of like pulling something out of ChatGPT and then chucking that into an email and editing it there.
Mhm.
But you really want to think about this in your product experiences to make sure that your users kind of editing within your application, because that will give you so much more information about what are the types of things that they're editing. And then if you've got that user experience, then capturing that data and just understanding the differential between what has been edited is super valuable for the engineering team.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that. And I think you touch on just another kind of unique aspect of AI development that might be worth exploring a bit, which is I think we've got now different levers to pull that have material impact on the data that is ultimately generated or leveraged through the experiences that we're delivering, right? So, like you said, traditional software, you've got these kind of unit tests and things you can design where, the inputs and the outputs are fairly predictable, right? Um, Now, obviously, we've got some software engineering that's happening to connect our applications to models. There are some variables introduced in the way that software engineering is handled, specifically in, model-centric API design, which is maybe a topic for another webinar, but important here, right? Then you've got the prompts, right? Those are written in some cases by engineers or machine learning experts, but in other cases by product managers or even by your users, right? And those could have material impact. And then you've got the user experience, right? Which with the way your interaction patterns are designed and the AI outputs are presented relative to other controls, that can meaningfully change the way folks perceive the response they're getting back and what they do next with it. So you've got all these different variables. And obviously, when you start collecting some of this data, that we've been talking about, your understanding of metrics, you want to act on those. But how do you know where to take action? Like, how do you know if the lever to pull is UX or prompting or,
Yeah.
maybe your LLM interface? So I don't know, a bit of an open-ended question there, but do you have any thoughts as to how maybe to design the metrics to isolate where they best apply or otherwise interpret where to act on the data that you're getting?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really great question, and something that we get a lot is the parallel here for us would be, okay, great, you're giving us these metrics, you're giving us these insights. Now, how do we actually incorporate this back into the workflow, and how do we actually act upon this? And yeah, I mean, this is like a nascent field, so there is lots of different ways that we see teams doing this. And I'll touch on some of the various options. I think what's just super important before I go into that is like you touched on as well, maybe the role of like specifically product managers in prompting. There are some companies that are super bullish on the idea that PMs should be writing the prompts because PMs have the best actual user context and the best understanding of the use case, and engineers should be building the APIs around the model that you referred to. um, I think my take on this, and this is kind of this may evolve, but right now the way I see the teams getting the best success is keeping prompt engineering as kind of an engineering discipline, but like very heavily supplementing how that prompt is built with knowledge from product managers. And so feeding that knowledge back in, not necessarily the PMs actually writing the prompts, but feeding that user those user insights and that user learning back into the prompts is super important. This is the first impact, a way to bring this back in. Once you've then edited your prompt, it's probably quite unlikely that you're going to be sort of swapping out a model or tuning a model at this stage, but that could be an avenue to explore if you see kind of on the user experience side of things that users are really actually not getting anywhere with your model. Fine tuning is an option, although kind of with the generalistic capabilities of these models. Normally, it's a prompt template. Prompt engineering can get you very far. However, what you can do is, and what we see a lot of teams doing is modifying guardrails, because a lot of teams who have released early with LLMs have kind of really heavily guardrailed exactly what the LLM can do, what the LLM can't do. And so being very flexible and going in and modifying those guardrails and having sort of a very explicit sort of set of those guardrails where the PM can actually see that they're not hidden in the code, but that are at a high level. So it's very clear between the whole company kind of how this LLM has been guardrailed. I think is like one learning as well that we've actually particularly seen from one team. And yeah, the last thing would be like we mentioned, also feeding those learnings back into your evaluation data set. We've kind of seen that some teams have really tried to automate this process, collecting user feedback if users are discussing specific topics, having kind of PMs actually annotate that kind of in a real time if they see kind of a user is actually struggling to get the LLM to actually do something in particular. And then as that's kind of retagged by a product manager or domain expert, that is then supplementing the evals. This is actually quite difficult to do in practice, and there's kind of various implementations of this. But if you're just reviewing and feeding that information back and acting on the prompt, acting on your evals, and maybe some of the guardrails, this is kind of some of the most common things that we've seen.
Super interesting. Yeah, I think I can see where that's a slippery slope if you start automating and overfit in one direction or the other, especially if you're not kind of controlling how you're interpreting the data effectively and what the ultimate levers to pull would end up being from a delivery standpoint. That's good stuff. I think this starts to build on a topic that we wanted to cover, which is, okay, you need to think about your metrics and your measurement of AI empowered solutions a little bit differently from your traditional SaaS applications. How do you get started, right? I think obviously recognizing the problem or the opportunity is step one. Now, let's say, you're one of the PMs on this call and you want to begin taking actions on this at your firm, or on your product. Are there any places you recommend, Jeff, for folks to get started?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say the real first place to get started is try and think about your product and your experience without AI in the picture. And so really try and just go through the exercise. This is for a new team who's maybe building like an AI native product. Think about the actual product experience and what are some of the success metrics. But in terms of like, from a product perspective, is it a purchase of a specific tool? Is it a user upgrading from a free plan to a paid plan? Like, what are some of those like markers that are going to help you to evaluate and then go backwards and from that retro engineer that and sort of understand which LLM conversations or which AI interactions resulted in those conversions. I think that's kind of the first place that I would say to start. And that's really nothing to do with AI. And you'd be surprised how many kind of AI native startups are going directly into very complex evaluation profiles without really having sort of an understanding of, okay, what is actually success for my users. Now, we don't see this so much with people who with startups who are maybe not AI native, but who are heavily betting on AI and who are bringing AI into their stacks, or enterprises, for example, who are bringing AI into their product. And for those startups, what I would really say is allow the PMs to really start seeing all of the prompts and generations if you can. Obviously, this is subject to data privacy and not always possible, but really sort of not hiding those away in a database, which we see time and time again, but really servicing these in your tooling that your PMs use, whether that be product analytics or whether that be in some form of analytical database if you're just querying sort of some basic SQL, but just getting that information so that teams can actually review is just super important, because by manually reviewing to get started, you are going to learn so much very quickly. And so that's the first thing I would say. Now, you can actually go quite far as well with a PM without really involving your engineering team as well, which is quite cool. And so obviously we talked about reviewing sessions manually, but also then going one step further, you've got also public models available to you. And so you can leverage these large language models that have huge context windows. By the way, we don't actually test that really on a day-to-day basis when we're talking to ChatGPT and getting it to write us an email. But you can actually paste in files or sort of large quantities of this unstructured data. And so there's nothing stopping you. And we've seen like a lot of teams that we work with, the way they really start is by trying not to chuck all of your data into ChatGPT. Hopefully you have some secure setup and an LLM that is working within your product, that is not just forwarding all of your data to OpenAI, but in the early days, that might not be so important for you. But at least, yeah, leveraging the capabilities of these models to summarize. And you can then just really start playing around with how you question the LLM, by putting all of those conversations in context and trying to understand things like user intents, or highlight to me some sessions where users are not getting success from the LLM. And you'd be surprised how much value that actually provides pretty quickly. Then I guess shameless plug for my tool Trubrics, we kind of plug into all of the product ecosystems. So for example, if you guys are using Segment, or if you're using maybe Mixpanel, Amplitude, the traditional product analytics tools, we kind of can also collect data from there, and run all of these type of analytics that we've been discussing within a tool like Trubrics. And then, yeah, if you can go one step further and you can really get your engineering team on board, and you've discussed with them about how important analytics is and how important these metrics trickle back down into their workflows to actually make these LLMs or even agentic workflows better. Then sort of thinking about this from like starting from like the user ID, making sure that all of your prompts and generations there are associated to a user ID. whether that's kind of private or not, whether you can actually see which user that is, or whether that's just a random ID. At least being able to associate that to an ID is super powerful for you guys, because then you can start breaking down, okay, what users are, what are my power users, and what can I learn from them?
Mhm.
Um, and then yeah, the more kind of advanced applications, I would say. Um, Obviously, like getting these analytics in real time can be super useful for you, especially just after a launch. Maybe you've launched a new feature and you want to get kind of a snapshot hourly of this. Getting real time analytics is super beneficial. But then also, what is more and more important in these product metrics is not just getting analytics on like the prompt and generation level or just on the generation level, but actually getting um, analytics based on the whole session or based on the whole conversation. Because what we see a lot is that um, if you're trying to measure success of a user interaction, for example, um, a user could be very frustrated in the middle of their session with the LLM just for one event. And normally, when you're kind of running basic analytics, you will just highlight that and you will kind of most probably deem that as an unsuccessful interaction. But if you're able to run some form of aggregated metrics on the whole session, you can feed in to that LLM the whole conversation, and then you can see, okay, well, are we actually able to salvage a conversation that's gone badly and to actually turn that into a success? And in what cases were we able to do that? In what cases were we not? And these are
Mhm.
types of insights that are a bit more subtle, a bit more advanced, but some things that you can really learn a lot from as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And that's something I wanted to ask you about was kind of differences in data structure in storage for this category of analytics. So it sounds like you kind of just outlined one, which is, thinking through how you might capture this information in a way to be able to aggregate it up at one extra level, right? Instead of like the most granular interactions, aggregate those
Mhm.
up into some session definition. Um,
Yep.
so that's a great example. Are there other examples like that, or maybe just attributes that we would want to make sure our payloads include so that, when we walk into a conversation with engineering, we can bring some real kind of tactical direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way think about this at Trubrics is kind of got like three layers. The first layer, like we were speaking about, is really on an event layer. A single, let's say, prompt or a single generation that is linked to either a user ID or maybe an assistant ID. Um, that assistant ID can be, a model name, or if it is like an agentic workflow, it can maybe be a succession of steps, an ID that links to that succession of steps. Um, that's kind of level one. The second level is really looking at kind of the prompt and generation as a pair, and maybe some feedback as well that is associated to a generation. So being able to kind of have, in technical terms, we more call that a trace. And a lot of kind of the technical tools that are used by engineers, you will hear tracing is something that's extensively used in production to evaluate models. That's level two. And level three, a level of aggregation above, is there's actually two different ways of grouping this. So we talked about what we call like a thread ID or a conversation level. This basically will group all of the interactions between a user and a model that are text-based. And so here you can start running sort of, yeah, aggregations on that text data. But also getting all of those actions at the session level is very important. And the way we distinguish between kind of the actual conversation and the overall session is kind of the session actually will contain all of the actions that the user is doing from the moment when they log on, any sort of configuration they're doing, any of the actual conversations that are happening. So you might have multiple conversations with, depending on the complexity of your app, maybe multiple conversations with multiple different agents at different points in the workflow. For example, you can imagine, onboarding in B2B is a huge place where we see a lot of success of LLMs. And so you might have a user interact with an onboarding agent. Then you might have that same user interact with an agent about some documentation. Um, and so being able to group those not just on a conversation level that's like on an assistant level, but actually on a session level, so kind of their active session, and grouping those conversations. So they're that's how we think about it at Trubrics, and we run analytics on kind of the level that you want of aggregation.
That's super insightful, and super helpful, I think, for people who are thinking through this. Um, the place that leads me naturally is, okay, now I've got all of this data. How do I make sense of it? And I think, again, just for everything that we've been discussing, we're now in a world of less black and white outcomes than we've had in the past. So you need a little bit of different sort of interpretation of success, and how you kind of identify your good and bad outcomes in all of this data that you're collecting. So have you seen any best practices emerge, or just maybe, they haven't happened enough to be like deemed best practices, but just some successful approaches to kind of interpreting the data that you're collecting and aggregating it up into something that people can consume and draw some information from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number one metric that we look to derive for AI teams, especially within sort of conversational user interfaces, is when is the model kind of apologizing or saying that they actually cannot fulfill a request. And this is something that, it's actually pretty easy to set up. And you can get a lot of value from that, because essentially what that means is that the user intent, or the user prompt just before that is something that the LLM is kind of refusing, is trying to get out of that. Maybe it's because it's guardrailed in a difficult way. Maybe because it just doesn't have that in everything it's learned. Maybe you fine-tuned it on a specific subset of data, but it doesn't have that in its context. Maybe it's doing some RAG, so it's going to fetch some documents, and then it's giving you an answer based on a summary of those documents. But maybe it's apologizing, saying it doesn't have access to the specific documents that you're requesting. And so what we see is a super powerful metric that a lot of teams implement, is really that. When is the AI actually, it's stating that it's not able to fulfill the request. Once you have that, then you can start breaking that down by sort of, topics. What are some of the specific topics, or what are some of the user intents at an aggregated level that our LLM is not able to cater for? And then what's super interesting about this, going one step further, is this doesn't just give you insight on how to improve your model, how to improve your prompt template, but it actually gives you insight into how to improve your whole product, because all of a sudden you're sort of seeing what users are asking that you hadn't anticipated, and that your model isn't really capable of giving an answer to. And it might be that actually your whole product doesn't have that functionality. And so you're actually not just learning how to improve the LLM, but actually you're getting feature requests through kind of this medium for your whole broader product. So that's one of the metrics that we see kind of really working super well, especially at these early days when the models are quite guardrailed.
Yeah, I love that. Nice and simple, makes a lot of sense, and something I could see how you could identify programmatically, which is obviously really helpful. This has been great, Jeff. We've got just over 15 minutes left, so I'd love to jump into Q&A. If anybody on the call has any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'd love to take the chance to address them here live. I've got one just to start that occurred to me during this conversation. And so, talking to some folks in the field, I hear a lot of interest in this maker checker pattern of models. I think this has kind of grown in popularity with the introduction of more of these reasoning models, the O1s and O3s of the world. And obviously the idea you're kind of giving a reasoning model the instruction to check the work and provide some assessment of it for a lower level model. Introduces some interesting opportunities to scale your analysis of the lower level model performance, but maybe also creates a new dependency to make sure that checker model is also performing adequately. So just curious how that's manifesting for you guys and what you're seeing emerge as opportunities and best practices with that kind of design pattern.
Yeah, definitely. So I think of any type of like multi-step workflow or agentic workflow or make a checker setup, like you were mentioning there, where you're not just having an LLM that is maybe summarizing some knowledge or just giving you an answer based on what it has in context, but where you're actually really trying to bring that the power of an LLM into a workflow, which I think you're referring to. This kind of, I think my first advice, especially to product managers, would be to not get bogged down in these steps because there is a lot that you can learn by looking at, what the user learns. That's essentially what we're really used to looking at in product, and what I still have super strong conviction that we should be focused on, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how many steps an LLM is taken. It's about kind of, does the user get to success? Now that might just be in the prompt that they're showing, or did that user actually go on to make a purchase or upgrade or whatever it is that it's your success metric. So my first advice would be to kind of ignore those initial steps. Then when you want to actually start looking into it and you want to try and understand, okay, are the different events that my LLM is all the different tasks that it's completing within that workflow, are they bringing success to my users, and which kind of combinations of these actions are and which aren't. Then starting from sort of very, very basic event tracking. What we don't want to do is kind of bringing in like full tracing of what your engineers would see into product analytics, because it's fundamentally two very different things, and it's going to just introduce a lot of noise that's going to be very sort of difficult for you to appreciate. But some, you can pull out some metrics. For example, a lot of the agentic workflows, the LLM is actually trying to complete a task. So did the LLM actually get to a task at the end? And you can have discrete events that you can track as like AI events. Okay, my AI, yes, it did. It booked me it booked this user some tickets, for example. You can track then like metadata, for example, how many steps did the LLM take? How many documents did the LLM get to make this to respond? What was the latency? Because latency was hugely important before, but it's even more important now. You mentioned these reasoning models that think, their processing time in real time is varying considerably. And so, if you're discussing with ChatGPT, or maybe then you're jumping into a B2B SaaS app and you have maybe some kind of conversational experience, some users will get very frustrated by sort of long latencies, and understanding that is going to be a lot more impactful for you as a product person than trying to understand, okay, why is my LLM making these 4 or 5 steps before talking to the user.
Mhm.
That would be some of my 2 cents on that.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, the you know latency angle I think is a good just reminder that some of the traditional metrics that we have paid attention to historically don't evaporate when it comes to applying AI. That stuff still matters and is something that you want to keep an eye on. It raises another question that is interesting to me, which is, we talked about kind of getting started with applying metrics and when you're working with AI products. I think there's maybe even a step before that, which is, how do I think about where to get started and applying AI in the first place, right? And ideally, that's a metrics-driven decision, maybe driven by your traditional SaaS metrics that you're already collecting in something like an Amplitude or a mixed panel, like you said. So I'm curious, like, do you have any thoughts on potentially traditional SaaS metrics that might indicate that AI is a useful tool to address some of the challenges you're observing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that I mean, the first thing I'll say is it's super application dependent. Um, but what we've seen teams having quite good success with is releasing features in like AI features fast, but in beta to a couple of close users. This is how we do things at Trubrics, and this is what we've seen as well from a lot of our users. Um, because these models, they have huge capacity, as we've all seen, and letting them kind of run wild in when you can in specific user interfaces can be sort of, you can reduce things down to get a beta release to very simple terms. Even if you're thinking about, okay, I've got this idea of this agentic workflow, um, just reducing that down to like a single LLM call or maybe two LLM calls, but and then getting that into the hands of some of the users and really trying to appreciate, okay, is this actually something that is valuable for us to look at, and evaluating then. I think it's always been interesting to release software early and get feedback. I think that's even more important now. So that's how I would go about, yeah, thinking about if you're thinking about releasing some AI features, just go for it.
Mhm. I like that. Yeah. No need to wait at this point. Um, cool. And then I also think something else that came to mind just during the course of our conversation was I work in a B2B atmosphere. I know many of the folks who join us on these calls do as well. And, depending on the industries that you serve, they may or may not face their own regulatory burdens. Mine certainly do, legal, financial services, accounting, consulting, et cetera. So, it brings up some interesting questions around data collection and metrics. Obviously, more is often more when it comes to collecting information to better understand the user experience. But you've got then this pressure from the client base and elsewhere to, first and foremost, make sure you're not feeding that back into an LLM and inadvertently resurfacing something sensitive to another client. I think, everybody's probably pretty familiar with the controls that you can use today to avoid that. But even just, having access to certain inputs or outputs surfaced to engineers or to other team members internally, that can be cause for concern despite its criticality to good AI development. So this consideration has got to come up for you, I'm sure.
Yeah.
How do you talk about it? How do you help your clients navigate it?
Yeah, for sure. So for those of you guys who work in like regulated industries or where data privacy is a real struggle for you, um, I think like product analytics then becomes a must because you can then basically observe aggregated metrics. Now, your analytics setup will look slightly different, and your measures of success will look slightly different because you won't be able to actually read the inputs and outputs like you were mentioning. But having some form of pipeline where you're not storing that data, but you're still tagging it and you're aggregating it, then becomes even more important because that's kind of your only learnings. And a lot of the time, you're the in some of the metrics that we spoke about, if you're tagging, sorry, just topics and sentiment, and intent, this is at a high level. You're really getting rid of basically everything, but you're keeping what's important to you. And so having some form of ingestion pipeline where you can work on something like that, where you're not actually storing the inputs and outputs, but you're aggregating it and then discarding it. That's how we see teams tackle that currently.
Mm-hmm. Um, you mentioned the tagging that raises a question of like where does AI help with the pipeline today for some of this data collection and analysis, and maybe where do you anticipate it being applied in this overall problem?
Yeah, so it is a bit of a meta problem where, AI is observing AI, and I think that the 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 way kind of the we see things is that AI will help you to aggregate. It's really a question of that. AI will help you to aggregate large quantities of unstructured data. And it definitely does feel meta because there's LLMs working on top of LLMs. Um, but it's super important, and this is kind of more of a philosophy. We get the question all the time of like, well, can't we just kind of feed this back into the model? Like, why do we have to actually surface insights? We don't, why do we really need to know about any of this? Um, but for us, it's still super important because as you're building product, having oversight on what's actually happening under the hood, and surfacing the correct amount of information for review is super important. So yeah, the way we use LLMs, and the way you will see LLMs used in analytics is really just that. It's aggregating large quantities of text data. Now, what's forward thinking, super also really interesting is, we spoke about how we can start looking at more on a session level. So not just feeding in the inputs and outputs of the model, but every interaction that the user has had on, for example, a website or an application. And within there are sort of structured inputs, like just discrete events of them clicking on different buttons and sending different events. But there's also the inputs and outputs of that they're getting to and through from the model. Um, what we're working on, and I think this is kind of pushing the boundary, is how much can we actually aggregate those sessions to really sort of get aggregations on, okay, was this overall session, given everything that was considered, positive or negative, was it a success or not, and then getting the LLM to actually generate an explanation to why, and then so that alone, and being able to sort of understand, okay, where the LLM is saying that this isn't a good outcome. You're not just taking kind of on an event level, but you're taking the whole session. This becomes super powerful because then you kind of have like, okay, let me see some of these unsuccessful topics or unsuccessful explanations, and you can start just reading like a little three-phrase summary of a user who has had a failed experience and why. And so that kind of abstracts away from all of the complexity really of insights and just monitoring sort of discrete metrics, but you're then just kind of reviewing, okay, leaving a lot up to the LLM, but as these models become more powerful, like we will just be delegating more and more up to them.
Mhm. Good segue into a question I wanted to wrap on here, which is just you're somebody knee deep in this space, really engaging critically with the changes that large language models and AI in general are bringing to technology. What is something that you're super excited about by the future that you see and that's coming, and what's something that is maybe not scary per se, but concerning at least?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the what I'm super excited about is just the level of information that we're now able to extract from, like we were just discussing, from sessions, and we get an understanding of our users that brings us as business owners and also like product managers who are working on products, brings us so much closer to users. And so even though we're not like necessarily on customer calls every day, it's almost as if we were, because now with these interactions between our applications and users, there's so much more rich and there's so much more information than there was when it was just a point and click website. So that's something that I'm like continuously just really excited about, and building product for users where you know so much about them and so much about what they want from your product. And then I think on the flip side, like, yeah, there is a like, it's an unsettling time, I think, for a lot of people. And I think that even for me, as so I've been working in AI for the last 7 or 8 years. And yeah, my first couple of interactions with some of these large language models back 3 years ago, were pretty unsettling, especially as a new startup founder. I mean, ChatGPT was released 6 months into us creating Trubrics, and we were working on a concept that was actually quite similar to what we are now. But yeah, those first interactions were very kind of unsettling, and I think that we should just remember that we are building with this technology in the way that we want, and I think that I'm fundamentally optimistic about that. So yeah, it's normal to be sort of unsettled, but I think that's been the case throughout history with technological innovation. So
Yeah. Good note to end on there. I think yes, natural to observe this with a bit of a side eye, but a lot to be excited about, and ultimately a ton of potential and opportunity for all of us here who are thinking about this. And certainly, if you're making time to join a webinar like this during your workday, you're probably on the right track to keeping up with these trends. So, Jeff, this has been an awesome conversation. Thanks again so much for making the time today. And thank you all for joining us on this webinar. We'll have more to come, and hope to see you next time.
cheers,
Thanks all.
Dan. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.